The dungeons were a place that appeared the moment the gate opened. There were many monsters in this place, and it was fought by the hunters, who were superhumans. After 10 years, more and more hunters appeared, and after a while, ordinary people got used to the existence of hunters. In order to become a hunter, you have to pass the tower, and the higher a person rises, the stronger he will be. All hunters are summoned to the tower, and then become superhumans, who fight in the dungeon. Everyone was advised to climb the tower as high as possible, because it directly affected future strength. True statistics was cruel, because about 80% of people could not even pass the tutorial. Those who reached 10 floors were called E-level, those who reached the 20th floors were called D-level, those who reached the 30th floors were called B-level, and those who reached 5/10th floors were called A-level. While the protagonist now stood in front of the entrance to the 100th floor and was fully prepared to conquer it. He was serious about getting through the tower. The protagonist was looking at his phone. There was a video of an S-level hunter. At this point, the number of floors that Kim Hansen could reach was 61 floors. The protagonist only dreamed of becoming the chosen one to get into the tower and change his horrible life. The guy thought about his life. He didn't have his parents. Even his close friends weren't alive anymore. He thought about the fact that he just needed a chance to go up to the tower. Suddenly, the guy's thoughts were interrupted by a blow right on the head. The man who delivered the blow said the hero was looking at his phone as usual. The guy started poking his finger in his forehead and saying that the hero should do his job as an inventory clerk. The fat guy apologized for the team member's behavior. The protagonist said it was okay and said that this is how that person shows friendship. The protagonist pulled himself together. He was determined to do a great job this time. After a while, he was walking in front of the group. He didn't understand why they'd put him in front. He even assumed that they wanted to make cannon fodder out of him. The fat guy waved to the hero, and he was glad that there was at least one normal person in the team. Suddenly, the protagonist was kicked in the back with a leg kick, causing him to fall to the ground, dropping things. The guy didn't understand what the hunters were doing now. While the team started to raise a defensive barter, the protagonist looked at the guys who were smiling, leaving the guy behind the shield. Pig started talking and filming. It was what was called a dogfighting show. He began to explain that the fight would be a red carrier and a huge number of hounds. As the monsters were heading towards the hero, the pig announced that they would be donated as much as possible. The guy came to the realization that he was caught in a trap. This transmission put in one space of ordinary man and monsters, and made bets on who will survive. The protagonist realized that since it is illegal, even if he manages to survive, the hunters will kill him on the spot. Now the guy came to understand why these guys had such a high reward. At that time, the monster was already on the approach to the man. The monsters jumped on the protagonist, not knowing what to do. The guy miraculously managed to avoid one attack, but even so his hand was wounded by the claws of the beast. He could not understand how to fight, while the other enemies continued their offensive. The hunter started joking about the useless carrier and saying that they should make more donations. At that time, the main character was being bitten by enemies, and he seemed to hate his abusers. One of the hunters said that the hero will also become fodder for monsters like his family. After this guy could not help himself and warned that he would definitely kill these hunters. They started laughing as they knew that the hero would definitely die. At that time, the guy grabbed a whistle. After he blew it, a powerful sound was heard. This sound was heard by a huge number of monsters. This outcome scared the hunters, and they asked the guy to stop. One of the enemies ran out of the barrier to stop the guy. He reached out his hand to take the whistle, but the monster intervened, which sank its fangs right into his hand. The hunters were surrounded by monsters, which pleased the protagonist, who reminded him that he had promised that all the hunters would die. The guys were screaming, but the protagonist noticed that one of the monsters attacked him. The guy seemed to be able to dodge, but the beast bit him on the neck, which made the hero scream in pain. After a while, there was a lot of blood on that spot. The hero watched with his last strength as the monsters ate the corpses of the mischievous people he hated so much. The guy tried his best to survive, but eventually became dog food. Only the thought that he repaid his enemies warmed the saddened heart of the guy. Suddenly the protagonist saw and noticed that the conditions were met, and he was invited to the tower. After a while the hero woke up in an unknown place. He was very surprised and jumped up from his seat. Remembering what happened to him, he could not understand how he did not die. Later he remembered the notification that he had gotten into the tower. The guy assumed that he was resurrected because of the coins. In this place, thanks to the coins, regardless of the cause of death, can come back to life. The protagonist remembered that the number of coins was different for everyone, and their number can only be found out after passing the tutorial. The guy was on the first floor, and the tutorial lasted up to 5, and the system advised him to go up the tower. It seemed that the protagonist was very happy about this opportunity. For the sake of this day, he learned a huge amount of information, as well as he diligently prepared by doing physical training. Now the hero had an opportunity, and the first thing he decided to focus, he was determined not to miss the chance given to him. The guy managed to get to the first floor, where he was already waiting for the goblin. He immediately noticed the new hunter and headed in his direction. The task of the first floor was to hunt one goblin. The enemy started laughing at the hero, which seemed to make him very angry. The guy pulled out a knife and was determined to deal with the enemy right now. He instantly vaporized from his seat and struck directly at the monster. The enemy received a crushing blow with his knee, after which he flew off a short distance. The protagonist did not waste time, and instantly moving the knife to the right position sat on top, already preparing to deliver a decisive blow. The guy attacked the chest of the goblin, after which the task was over and the only opponent was killed. The guy called such a challenge a real breeze. The hero said aloud that it was easy for him to handle, but suddenly the guy's body was pierced by the blade that the goblin had thrust in. This really surprised the protagonist. He saw another goblin in front of him, who stood and licked, imagining the taste of the hunter. The protagonist had only heard of one enemy, but there was no way he expected to see another. Another coin was spent, and the protagonist returned to the point of objection. The protagonist could not understand, because even in the rules it is written about only one goblin. He even assumed that the government and guild spread false information. He could not answer the question of why this, but decided to score, and went to the first floor again. The protagonist spent 3 hours on the floor. He did not intend to rush his last time, but to get all the information and then act. Suddenly the hunter's attention was attracted by a sound. The source was a goblin, who was walking and humming a tune. The guy decided to follow this goblin. He led the hero to a huge building. Inside there were now 2 goblins who were looking at the statue. The protagonist did not understand what this object. He heard that on the floors of the tutorial cannot be artifacts. Then the hero remembered the interview of a hunter who said that it is hidden treasures help to climb higher. The guy decided to get the treasure by all means. He threw his blade with all his might. The goblin managed to notice the attack, but his body was unable to dodge, and he received a blow to the chest. The second goblin reacted, but as soon as he turned around he saw the protagonist ready to strike. The guy managed to clear the first floor. Then he took a closer look at his find. He took the statue in his hands, and it suddenly began to vibrate. Then lightning appeared, and this thing began to transform. The protagonist became the first person who was able to get this statue by fulfilling the hidden conditions. The protagonist was able to obtain S-rank eyes looking at the stars, which allowed him to see hidden information. The protagonist was shocked that he was able to get something like this. The guy couldn't believe it, since the highest level of hunters was AAA rank, and the guy was able to get S-rank powers. The protagonist didn't know how to use the ability he got. He tried, and saw that the hidden rewards of the first floor were missing. Now the main character could pick up all the hidden rewards of the tower, which made him incredibly happy. As soon as the guy was on the second floor, he was instantly wounded in the arm, which surprised him a lot. The protagonist began to run away from an unknown monster, in parallel complaining about the government and the guild, which spread false information. The enemy was a kobold, but turns out to be capable of using weapons. The protagonist managed to pull away a little. He reflected on the fact that he did not realize the first time that the guides are not to be trusted at all. As he reached for the arrow, he thought about the fact that he had to consider all possible outcomes. The protagonist decided to heal himself first and used a potion. The protagonist realized that since the enemy has a great sense of smell, he will find him quickly. So he touched some liquid, and using his eyes, he got the information that this tree sap is able to hide the guy. The protagonist was surprised by his cool ability. He turned in his fist. After a while, a monster arrived at the place looking for the hunter. At that time, the protagonist was already on the tree ready to strike at any moment. The guy instantly moved, and although the enemy heard it, but did not have time to dodge, and got hit directly with a knife. The protagonist very furiously struck another blow, and the second floor was passed. As the hero came to a good decision, he was credited with 300 points, while the eye advised to take the nail from the finger of the kobold. The guy did not hesitate long to take this nail, after which a portal appeared from which food and water began to pour out. The hero was surprised by this outcome on the second floor. The reward for the hero was the opening of the community of the Serber Korea. The guy observed how a man swore at the government for false information. Now the hero was certain that he was not the only one who went through this. At the time, some people said that the goblin was alone. The hero decided to finally get started and proceeded to register his nickname. The protagonist created a completely absurd nickname and decided to attract attention by posing. The protagonist was going to whip out information about the full tutorial. The protagonist decided to start posting the right information. He was determined to find fellow travelers. For his plans, the guy needed to move faster. The hero found himself on the third floor, where he had to go through a trap. The guy seemed to have not expected such an outcome of events at all. From the floor began to appear holes, from which instantly flew arrows, from which the protagonist miraculously managed to dodge, after which the guy fell to the ground. It was at this point the hunter almost died. The protagonist remembered that the guide wrote that you need to check the traps, exposing his hand in front of him. But now, he was not going to go through with these bastards. He activated his eye, after which he began to release a huge amount of energy. Thanks to his skill, the guy managed to get the location of all the traps. Absolutely all the traps in the room were disarmed, and the hero was congratulated for passing the third floor. The hero complained that the tutorial was incredibly difficult. The guy was able to get a hearty meal that doubled his regeneration for 1 hour. The guy ate, and at the same time complained about the terrible traps. One of them was 2 huge balls that almost crushed the hero. Then he was waiting for a bright fire show. Then the guy came across a trap with blades. The hero realized that without his ability would not have been able to pass, even having hundreds of coins. The protagonist seemed surprised. It turned out that after passing the third floor, you can see your characteristics. The protagonist was very happy, because his magic power was at the highest level. Now the guy with such a good mood was going to further past the tower. At that time, in the area of living on the 30th floor of the tower, the man realized that although he had the last coin left, there was no way he could get out such a small level, because he knows a lot, and he would simply be killed. A guy who was talking about publishing in the community ran into the man. He explained that the tutorial channel was getting hype again. The man asked him to show him what was going on there. There the main character was talking about ways to continue the first floors of the tower. The man seemed very angry to read such detailed information, but after he saw the messages that you shouldn't trust the guilds, he was really angry. Then he hit the table, and it broke. The guy was frightened by this behavior of his brother. The same ordered to release the hunters and find the protagonist. He realized that if the leadership finds out, he is finished. For this reason, he was going to quickly eliminate the hero. At that time, the guy felt that it was now that someone was talking about him. The protagonist managed to get a rank and bonuses from it. Now he was getting points by helping people pass the tower. The rank was the key to becoming a high-level hunter, and the one the hero got also developed his stats. Now the guy was sure that he should continue and decided to check the comments. The protagonist helped a huge number of people. Now the guy was sure that in the future he will definitely have companions. At that time there were also guys who tried to cheat newcomers. The guy was angry, because the guys covered the government, which with their own hands killed people. The hero was even more fired up to smash the government's lies, and show people the truth. The protagonist was sure that while people would find him, he would have time to become stronger than them. The protagonist got to the hidden place of the third floor hidden pit. The guy managed to get a huge amount of useful items. On the fourth floor the hero had to climb a rock. The guy managed to get a dark blue tree. The joy was no limit. The guy was screaming. The protagonist rejoiced that the government is rotten, and now he can safely destroy it. The guy complained about the fact that the height of the rock changed from the number of artifacts. Suddenly appeared some stone. When the guy paid attention to it, there was an inscription. There was written the name of John Traylor. It was a great sage from the past, who had reached the 92nd floor, and was determined to clean the tower completely. The guy was surprised that there were people who had risen higher than the pros from his world. Now the guy was sure that the tower had existed much longer than they had known about it. The protagonist decided not to think about it, but to continue climbing the tower. He intended to enter the last floor of the tutorial. On this floor, it was necessary to kill the boss, and she learned that there were also skill boxes. It turns out that the boss is picked up by the skills of the hunter, because of which the level of difficulty has increased many times, and was called a fish warrior of the highest third class. The guy started screaming that this was too much. The guy was horrified by the monster he saw. The enemy immediately rushed to attack, while the guy miraculously managed to avoid the attack. Each blow was deadly, and the hero was very lucky to dodge them. The guy was surprised by such power of the monster. He began to run away with all his might. He realized that he cannot win with his bare hands, and he needs skills. The protagonist, with the help of his eye, was able to determine the locations of all the skills. He was intent on picking up the skills that were closer first. Once the guy arrived at the location, he was really hoping to get something useful. He reached out his hand and opened the discount boxes, after which a fog appeared in that place. It was the smoke screen skillet, which now helped the hero a lot. The enemy used his shout to dispel the fog, and the hero used the second skill race, and ran straight to the next skill. He almost reached the place, but right above him was already flying monster. After his fall, the ground began to break. The boss grabbed the protagonist. The guy realized that the boss is terribly fast. He reached behind his back and grabbed his sword, then threw the weapon directly at the enemy, and he began to scream. After such an attack, the enemy struck a blow, from which the hero was thrown right into the stone. The enemy saw the guy's body, which did not move, and was preparing to strike the last blow. But the hero outsmarted the monster and activated a medium-level boxing skill, then thanked the enemy for this opportunity. The guy was lucky, and got a B-level firebomb skill. The enemy struck, which made the hero get knocked back again. This time the guy was killed right in the rock, and in the place of collision appeared a hole. The hero began to come out of there. He complained about the fact that they did not give time to even rejoice skill. The enemy was about to attack again, but the protagonist attacked first, and stabbed the monster in the leg with his dagger. The guy asked if it hurt the monster, and it started screaming furiously. The enemy attacked the guy, who managed to dodge, after which he promised to make the boss much more painful, and used his new skill, from which the monster's body was pierced through. The guy joked that it smelled like fried fish. The hero said that there is nothing more effective than fire to catch a fish on land. The protagonist used the skill one more time to finish the boss for sure. The guy managed to defeat the invincible enemy, and for this, he received 1,500 points. With joy, he immediately fell to the ground, and began to shout about what he did. The system explained that the protagonist would receive additional rewards for the level of the defeated boss. A star appeared above his head, and then it began to shine so brightly that the guy had to turn away. On the face of the hero jumped some creature. He could not understand at all what it was. It was very similar to a frog, and it turned out the additional reward was a pet. The hero started to complain for such a reward, but his pet slipped out of his hands. The protagonist started looking at the characteristics of the frog, which turned out to be stronger than him, and an animal of chaos itself. The guy didn't seem very happy that some frog was stronger than him. The system explained that if the connection was low or the owner weaker, the pet could bite. The hero seemed worried about being bitten by his own pet. At that time the toad spat out something turned out to be a pebble that was instantly melted by its drool. After such a performance, the hero realized that the frog is really stronger. The guy didn't want this monster to follow him, and since it wasn't necessary, he packed up and said goodbye to the frog, wishing it a better life. The frog seemed to be very upset that his master was leaving. After the hero started to leave, the frog sat on his shoulder. The hero smiled and realized that the pet wanted to be with him. He offered to respect each other and offered the frog to be friends. The protagonist finally passed the tutorial and headed to the 6th floor. Once he was there, he saw a huge number of hunters around. In the safe zone, all wounds were healed, and here it was forbidden to kill players. After the crime appears the badge of the killer. The guy was incredibly surprised by the number of people who were able to pass the tutorial. The protagonist scolded the frog, which was behaving in a very harmful way. The guy asked about the pet's name. The protagonist began to think of a name that denotes the greatness of the frog, which is stronger than even its owner. The pet was very happy, but as soon as he heard the name, Dakshin immediately upset. He named his pet Absentee Super Frog Dakshin. The hero assumed that the frog liked it, and a man approached them. The man asked if the hero was new. After hearing the answer, he immediately introduced himself as a member of the Blue Dragon Guild and gave the protagonist a pellet that healed well. The guy looked at this pill, and thanks to his eye he realized that this medicine had an oblivion spell on it, and he would lose some of his memories of the tutorial. Now the guy realized that it was all because of the edited memories. There was no limit to his anger. Now he realized that people couldn't remember since their memories had been altered. The guy asked the man if he had eaten the same pill. He explained that he had, because he was a safe, and they in turn handed out such pills. He offered the protagonist right now to eat a pellet for healing. The guy didn't expect to have to eat the pill right in front of this man. He explained that according to the rules you have to eat it right in front of him. The man was yelling about the quest all over the street, blaming the government. The protagonist was holding the pill in his hands. At the time his pet seemed to be cheering something. He used his tongue to steal the pill, which incredibly surprised the protagonist. As soon as the man turned to the guy, he pretended to eat. On the outskirts of this floor was a guest house. The guy was thanking his beast who helped, so he also discovered the hidden property of restoring F rank. The protagonist was impressed by his pet's abilities, and he also remembered that the people he was helping would be going up to the 6th floor soon. The guy decided to write about everything, namely the 5th floor and the pellets. He didn't intend to lose those who were left behind. The guy had already finished writing the walkthrough, and decided to finally get to the other thing. He unbanned the store, and got the bronze level. For the upgrade needed 10,000 points. Also the system gave a hint, because at the auction you could get artifacts that are not in the store. The guy saw a huge list of equipment. The eyes of the main character helped to evaluate things. They advised to buy at first glance useless thing, after which was written off too much money, and he complained. It turned out that this thing was part of a set of one man who reached the 99th floor of the tower. if you collect all the things you can get his power. The guy was shocked by this news. He remembered the stone from the man who reached the 92nd floor, and the new thing that the hero got was probably a supreme artifact. The protagonist was determined to collect Felon's entire set in a short period of time. The protagonist spent an hour, but still couldn't find the other pieces, so he decided to stock up on other items and potions. The protagonist decided to proceed with the modification, after which the system congratulated him, and his body began to change. It was filled with hot flames. The modification was successful, and the main character's stats improved more than twice. The guy received a random box of powers. Thanks to the items that the hero collected on the quest, the level of the box began to increase manifold, and the system congratulated the box for being the highest level. Due to the fact that the hero was the first, he received 5,000 points. The protagonist decided to immediately proceed to the opening, and as soon as he saw his new power, namely S level, the linking skill, was not out of breath with joy. He started hugging his pet and talking to it with joy. The system told that the hero was the first to receive 2 powers, and the impossible happened. The hero's frog began to warn that the chaos energy was approaching. There was a hidden quest, mastering a new path. The protagonist could see his number of coins, and they were only 3, but to his surprise the number began to change. The system began to add coins to him. Began to appear a huge number of notifications that the number of coins of the guy continues to increase, and the number reached infinity. The hidden quest was to get to the 100th floor of the arable land, but the guy was shocked that he now had an infinite number of lives. He could talk confidently about the fact that now he would become the strongest hunter in the world. But suddenly there was despair, because in order to get out of the tower must either spend all the coins, or pass the tower to the end. Now he cannot get out of the tower at all. Now the guy to get out of the tower, it was necessary to pass it to the end. He began to count how much it took to pass 61 floors of the strongest hunter, and realized that he would need 10 years to get to the end. At the time, there was some sort of scandal of hunters, and people on the floor trying to check them out. One of the hunters grabbed a man by the skivvies, but behind their backs was a hunter marked with a red murderer sign. It was the manager who was in charge of public peace, and was the strongest on the floor. After seeing this, the mischievous man turned around and hurriedly left. At that time, the man could not understand who was the person who was putting a stick in their wheels. Suddenly he realized something and called people to him. He ordered to bring the person who wrote the 4th report, and then that person was brought. He couldn't understand what the matter was, but the manager without any hesitation gave an incredibly strong blow to the guy's leg. The leg was broken because of that wound, and the man was crying in pain. The manager asked the guy if he realized what he had done. He started to say that the man was guilty of breaking into the square. He also said that this unknown person could be the one they were looking for. He was also angry that because of the guy's mistake they couldn't find the hero. The manager said to be very grateful to the man for letting him live. He announced to the others that they should block all the portals and find the main hero. After that, all the soldiers ran to fulfill the assignment. At that time, the protagonist had a good night's sleep. He had just had a good meal, which affected his mood a lot. The guy said that his pet was a real glutton and happened to hear people start complaining about the guilds closing the portals. The heroes seemed surprised by this outcome. A little while later, the heroes stood on a tree branch and verified that all the portals were indeed closed. He checked absolutely all the portals and all were half guarded. The protagonist didn't fully know his abilities, but he had to force his way through. He also realized that he had never fought several people at once. He decided to wait for a good opportunity, and behind his back there was an explosion. The guy immediately reacted to it. At that time people were rioting because of what the guild was doing. But the manager came out and explained that such behavior is punishable. The others began to worship the manager. After this the hunters decided not to risk it and leave the place. The man did not understand where the main character was, and why he did not come. The information came from the higher floors that if the protagonist is the one, he should be caught immediately. The manager said that now they should check absolutely everyone and block the area. He explained that if a flare is fired, everyone should gather. Suddenly there was an explosion, and the man assumed that that's where the hero was. He instantly went to that place. The hero was tasked to kill this assassin. As a reward, he would get his skill. The guy first saw the killer hunters. At that time, the enemy did not wait and immediately went on the attack. The protagonist received a blow right on the head, after which he flew away, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. The enemy began to explain that it didn't matter if the hero was the culprit, because he intended to kill the guy first anyway. With the help of his eye, the protagonist saw the skills of the enemy. The guy could not understand the meaning of the killer's words. The enemy explained that in case the hero was the one from the community, the posts would stop after killing him. The enemy explained that the protagonist was more like a criminal than the one who was currently causing a ruckus in the square. The protagonist was exposed in such a simple way. The guy intended to show what happens when someone treats the lives of others in such a way. At that time, the enemy used a flare. The assassin explained that the guild members would be coming soon, but in the meantime, he was going to play with the guy. The protagonist realized that even this flare was worth much more than his armor. Attacking the protagonist said that the assassin is good because he is rich. Their attacks collided, after which the protagonist didn't have time to make a second attack before he received another kick. The enemy laughed while fighting the guy, but to his great surprise, the hero was able to block the kick. The guy knew all of his enemy's skills. At that time, the assassin seemed to be quite offended. Their fight continued with a huge amount of blows. The protagonist prepared to attack from above, but the enemy used a barrier that blocked the attack. The guy seemed not to expect to see such a shield. The enemy began to laugh at the weakness of the protagonist, but he did not hesitate long and attacked him with a fire bomb, after which there was a huge explosion. The hero said that such a shield is not a problem for him. At that time, the enemy was all in burns. He stood in place and seemed to feel not good. The assassin began to say that the protagonist made a mistake. The guy felt that the atmosphere changed, but the enemy was instantly behind his back and kicked him. From such an attack, the hero was thrown straight into a tree. He began to cough, as the damage received would be catastrophic. It turned out that the enemy was using a rank B skill that allowed him to double his stats once a day, and he also had a bracelet that controlled his weight. The protagonist was angry that such a bastard had gotten the artifacts. The guy realized that in order to defeat the Peak, he had to be willing to lose a limb. The protagonist turned to his pet and said that he trusted him. At that time, the assassin ran on the offensive. He promised to whip the hero so like a dog. He instantly moved around the guy and delivered a huge number of blows with his foot. The enemy intended to deliver a final blow to finish off the protagonist, but to his great surprise, the guy not only blocked the attack, but caught him by the leg. The enemy began to get nervous, but the guy did not give him time to retreat and got close to him. The assassin said that the protagonist is completely crazy. At that time, the hero said that he noticed that the enemy likes firecrackers. After such words, the protagonist used a fire bomb, and they together with the enemy exploded, creating a huge explosion. People started to worry about their manager. At that time, the enemy called the hero a real freak. He thought that the hero also wanted to die, but the guy explained that he would not die, because at that very moment, he was healed by his pet. The protagonist decided to continue what he had started, and there was another powerful explosion, and the guild members were terrified. The enemy was defeated, and the protagonist was able to get the skill as he killed his enemy. At that time, the guild hunters were at a loss as to what to do. The protagonist started collecting items, and with a joking smile turned around to the people and said that these treasures were now his. After such a scene, no one obstructed him, and he entered the 7th floor. From the 7th floor to the 9th floor was the development zone. The protagonist complained that he almost died, but he was happy that he had gotten great items from this fight, namely 3 artifacts with special effects. The toad began to croak as if demanding something. The protagonist recognized that if it wasn't for its treatment, he wouldn't have been able to win, after which he thanked the pet sincerely. The toad didn't seem happy. It was missing it. The guy realized that you can't put a thank you in your pocket. Then he called for a special meal with a huge amount of meat. He showed it to the toad, who was simply delighted. At that time, the enemy woke up in the Sandine Guild's guest house. He remembered that he had lost to a guy. Looking at the status window, he realized that even his skill had been taken away from him. He was determined to definitely find the protagonist and kill him. A subordinate came into the room, and the manager said that he was quitting from today. He said that he would give authority to this man, and said that he would follow him. Also, he asked what happened to the man who was raging on the Plaska. They arrived at the place, and the killer saw a terrible picture, as no one could stop that guy, and he went into the portal. At that time, the protagonist tried out his threat skill, which paralyzed the enemy for a while. The enemies became numb, and the protagonist instantly moved and caught all the goblins. So the protagonist instantly managed to fulfill the conditions of the floor. The guy intended to immediately go to the 8th floor. He remembered that these floors are the plot for development and assumed that there was something else in this place. The protagonist seemed to sense the enemies approaching, and he instantly turned around to continue killing monsters. The guy easily coped with the enemies, and the kill count has already passed 30. After a while, the protagonist destroyed 40 enemies and tired. After this, he was rewarded with a beginner's kit. The guy was interested, and a pill fell from the air. He immediately picked it up. It turns out that if he eats this pill, his stats will improve from killing monsters. The protagonist realized why this plot was for development. After consuming it, the effects began to take effect. The protagonist had already killed 100 goblins. He reflected that only kills after taking the pill counted. Now, he was determined to maximize the opportunity and become stronger. The goblins began to run away in terror from the fierce guy who was sizzling them with his skill. At this point, the hero had killed 125 goblins, and his stats were well up. True, now the protagonist had reached the limit of this pill. The guy was very happy, and thanked the pet for his labors. Although the guy wanted to rest, but he saw a unique quest where he had to deal with the boss. The guy couldn't see the hidden information even with his eye. The guy realized that even his eyes of this level are not omnipotent, and now he should start searching. The guy assumed that since this floor was all goblins, the boss was likely to be the same. He assumed a possible opponent. The guy ruled out impossible options, and smiling seemed to understand everything. His enemy will be a goblin with jewelry. The protagonist knew that such a monster is a real coward, but he is very interested in jewelry. The guy began to come up with a plan to find the enemy, and stroked his pet. He notified him that now he will have to work off his food. On the outskirts of the 7th floor, the boss smelled a very pleasant odor. He smelled incredible treasures, but he also smelled the odor of dead goblins. He couldn't decide what he should do, but he still decided to charge in and run at the smell of the jewels. The monster began to quickly search for that very thing, and looking closely, he saw something gold, which he was incredibly happy about. In his opinion, it was a golden figurine of a frog. The frog stood there and emitted a golden light. It looked behind its back where the protagonist asked it to be patient a little longer. There was a noise from the bushes. The protagonist saw the boss of the goblins. As soon as he noticed the statue, immediately rejoiced. After that, he instantly began to transform and awakened. The hero was surprised that the enemy could become so strong, but even so the hero thought that he could win. The enemy was advancing very fiercely. At that time the guy was using a fire bomb. He decided to cancel the effects of the golden-colored goods. The frog immediately hissed and started jumping. The enemy seemed to be furious at this outcome of events. At that time, the protagonist came down from the tree and called his pet. The latter jumped back to him and hugged his master, who said that the toad had done a good job. The enemy did not wait and immediately pounced on the guy. The protagonist decided to put the secret jewel in the inventory. At that time the enemy almost got the guy, and he was preparing to take the blow. Hell crumpled. As the jewel disappeared, so did the goblin's enhancement. The enemy seemed to be very scared. At that time the protagonist struck with the blunt side of his weapon, after which the quest was successfully completed, and he received 3,000 points and +1 to all stats. Since the boss was killed, all the monsters were hiding in the shelters. From the monster fell an item for storing things that can only be opened by the owner. The hero was happy not only this thing, because inside it was a huge number of items. The guy also received an enhancement skill, which randomly increased the stats. There was also a soul stone that the protagonist couldn't understand. But the thing that interested the guy the most was a piece of a key to the ruins. The ruins were only opened with the fulfillment of special conditions. The protagonist assumed that these keys could be obtained on each floor of the development. He was sure that they fell off the bosses. The guy didn't know when he would go up, so he decided to rest for now. It turned out that people's reaction to the information about the white pellet was quite negative. The guy thought that although the object erases memory, it also helps people to survive. The guy noticed that one of the hunters admitted that he was the one who broke the troops on the Plosca and entered the portal. The hero seemed to be happy that one of the people he helped was able to make so much noise. The hero also saw that the man had told about the survivalist kit. Because the text was written superficially, no one believed it. The protagonist decided to help the bald head. The hero began to publish a huge amount of information about the 7th floor. The guy got to the 8th floor, where orcs were waiting for him. It seems the protagonist was happy to see such opponents. Even the orcs could not resist the strength of the protagonist. He only needed one blow to kill the enemy. Due to the fact that the monsters were stronger, pill to increase starts began to take effect. After a short period of time appeared a huge shadow. This shadow was a huge monster that stood right in front of the hero. The monster threw a glove right in the guy's face, which surprised him. It fell to the ground, and the protagonist was notified that he was called to the fight, and that the time had expired and the fight was automatically accepted. The guy seemed to start to get a little nervous, while the enemy looked at him with a crazed look. The hero and the monster teleported to the venue, where they were surrounded by spectators. The protagonist assumed he had found himself at the Orc Championship. He was surprised by the way his opponent was showing off his muscles to the audience. The protagonist called the enemy a complete moron, and grabbing his weapon, he used acceleration to shorten the distance, after which the enemy called the hunter a cowardly coward. He was incredibly angry because the man dared to attack while posing. The protagonist easily won the victory, and started to complain that it was too easy. The guy noticed a strange thing on the enemy. He started to pick it up, and it turned out to be the medals of the tribe of Molars. The hero assumed that it was a useless thing, and it could be sold later. The protagonist received a huge number of notifications with tasks where he had to smash and defeat the tribes of orcs. The guy was surprised because he thought that this thing is useless, because of the fact that there was a strong man was called a warrior from each clan. After that, the space around began to distort, from which the protagonist closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he saw several enemies in front of him. Because of the appearance of a strong enemy, monsters were incredibly happy. The guy was frightened by the looks of these guys. At that time there were even more of them, and they began to pose with their muscles. The protagonist was shocked that the enemies became more and more. The guy found himself surrounded by huge monsters. After one of the enemies began to remove the glove, and other monsters followed suit, the protagonist realized that now he will be challenged by an incredible amount of challenges. He found himself covered in gloves and insulted his opponents. He began to shout that all enemies would attack him at once. Using a smoke screen, he disoriented his enemies. They were poorly oriented, and taking advantage of this, guy struck one of the monsters from the back, piercing his body through. The hero began to shout that everyone is waiting for such a fate. The enemies immediately rushed into battle with the man. The protagonist did not waste time and used his magic, namely threat, to immobilize the opponents, acceleration that would be as fast as possible to get close to them, and a cube that could give for a while a bonus to a random characteristic, which was strength, and it appeared on 4 indicators. The guy moved instantly, striking at each of the enemies. As a result of such a battle, the protagonist instantly destroyed the monsters. Thanks to this, he received 5,000 points and slightly pumped up his stats. Thanks to winning the tournament, he was able to challenge the ringleader. The system asked if the protagonist was going to do something. He wanted to rest, but the system did not give him time, and he had only 10 seconds to decide. The guy did not know how to answer, and yet he decided to agree and was moved to the leader of the tribe of orcs. The enemy was incredibly strong, and he also had an A-rank stamina. The guy assumed that his enemy was asleep and took up arms. While the monster did not react in any way, the guy decided to move behind his back and began to use the skill of explosion, after which there was a huge explosion. The hero assumed that the enemy could not survive after such a thing, but soon he was disappointed, as the enemy not only did not die, but remained seated in the same position. The monster finally woke up and looked at the hero with fierce eyes. The enemy said that it was not an invisible chair. He began to approach the hero and explained that it was squatting and began to squat. This outcome of events completely shocked the guy. He stood right in front of the protagonist, but suddenly turned around and headed in the other direction. The monster said that today he had a day of leg exercises. He grabbed a rock and turned it into dust with his bare hands. He said that because the guy interfered it was too late. He created an axe and said that the protagonist would have to redeem himself. The enemy was already in armor, and with weapons ready to fight. Because of the monster's scream, the protagonist was paralyzed. He began to breathe as deeply as possible. The guy was able to get his body in order, and decided not to think about anything. The protagonist used acceleration, and struck with his sword right on the ogre's body. The hero wasn't sure if he succeeded or not, but the counterattack made it clear that the enemy was alive. Because of this powerful blow, an explosion was created in the place where the hero fell. The guy instantly became a fighting stance. He realized that the opponent he was fighting was on a completely different level of strength. At that time, the monster swung to strike. From his attack, all around collapsed, but the guy was able to dodge, and approaching began to create a bomb of fire. There was a huge explosion. The guy began to rejoice in his victory, but the enemy attacked him again, which caused a new explosion. In the rock in which the hero was thrown back was a huge crater. The guy was able to survive, but he felt bad. Thanks to his ability to persevere, the enemy received mortal wounds, became stronger. The monster started to run at the protagonist, and he ran away. The enemy tried to attack, but the guy was able to dodge in time and avoid the damage. It seemed that the hero was cornered and he was finished. The protagonist did not want to give up and tried to use a threat. It seemed to work on such a huge monster. After the guy used a smoke screen, the days didn't last long, and the monster struck a blow to tear down the smoke screen. While the enemy was looking for the hero, called him a real monster because he was able to cope with these skills incredibly fast. The protagonist thought that his ability for the enemy is the same as the enhancement skill. Eyes began to give a clue, namely that the jocks have a weak point is the back. The guy started to think of a plan of action considering that the enemy had a weak back. Even knowing this information, he didn't know what to do. The toad came out and advised him to use tracking abilities. The protagonist remembered that he could drain skills. The protagonist knew that he could get a whole new average skill. The guy was incredibly excited about the new opportunity, but instantly a terrifying enemy appeared behind him, and although the protagonist had time to react, he struck a blow directly at the man, from which he was cut in half, and he began to disappear. Suddenly on the face of the monster was no taste of victory. It turns out the guy managed to survive, and he went to the enemy behind the back. He received the skill of foggy acceleration that allowed for a while to become invulnerable. The enemy did not hesitate to launch another attack, but the protagonist did not seem to be worried at all. He again used the new ability and disappeared, then appeared right at the back of the monster's head. He pierced the back of the enemy, and he instantly rushed to kill the guy, but it turns out the monster could not reach the back because of its developed muscles. The enemy couldn't realize what was happening. The protagonist used an item that made him twice as strong, then added a bracelet of gravity, and struck an incredibly strong blow right on the boss's back. The enemy held on. It seemed his skill was giving out, but the guy already had a plan. He used his fist to punch a hole in the monster's back, then started using his fire attack to burn the enemy from the inside. After using this skill, the enemy was torn apart. The protagonist was able to defeat the great tribal leader and completed the quest. Thanks to the victory, he gained +5 to all attributes. Thanks to this victory, all orcs were afraid of the protagonist for 24 hours. The guy was teleported back to the arena, and then began to rejoice that he was able to win. The reward started to be handed out, after which the protagonist received another part of the key. The guy went to his bag to get the second part, then joined them, and he almost had the key. The protagonist didn't know where those ruins were, but he was determined to find them. The protagonist was waiting for another reward, but something creepy fell right on his face. The guy started to tear the thing off, and realized that it was a concentrated clot of the great tribal leader, which contained his power. He couldn't understand it, because it looked more like an orc's poop. The miracle cure, he knew, was incredibly valuable, for it was the only thing that could make one stronger after leaving the tower. He remembered that the top hunter was a rank, but after eating the remedy, he had risen to S rank. The protagonist realized that the remedy wasn't that powerful, but he forced himself to eat the disgusting thing. He continued to eat while holding back his gag reflex. Thanks to this thing, the guy had raised his stats a lot. The protagonist started bragging to the pet about his new strength, after which he asked if he looked much stronger. The toad knocked the guy right on the head. The protagonist didn't realize why, but it turns out the mouth smelled like shit, and the beast didn't like that. The protagonist used the shower for 1,000 points, and felt just fine. The protagonist also used the alarm system to stay safe. The protagonist from the sale of the chief's Ollie Bard was able to buy a huge number of useful skills that helped in everyday life. The hero was happy that he had the opportunity to buy all sorts of cool stuff. The guy offered his pet a snack. The hero decided to write about the passage while eating. Hunter is used to writing in that style, and is already typing text quickly. Me too, by the way, ah. The guy got a reward of 10 points to all stats, and now had 89 points. He had 11 points to go before the next reward. The protagonist expected to advance quickly, but even so, if he keeps doing this, the guy noticed that a familiar nickname had posted that there was a fashion to dispel the guild on the 6th floor, and he repeated it. Turns out the guy just trashed the guild house for no particular reason. The protagonist was surprised that they were able to deal with the killer, but realized that he decided to go to the top and thought about it, because most likely it was done to catch him. Most likely, he will again strive with the enemy, when he will be much stronger. The guy realized that he no longer had time to talk. He decided to continue improving his characteristics. On the 7th floor, the goblin was running away, and was being chased by an assassin, who threw his blade to deal with the monster with ease. The guy was able to kill 100 goblins, and realized that this was the end. The killer realized that the information was true. Now he thought about the fact that the tutorial was true. He realized that the talk about the white pellet was true. He didn't understand how she knew about it, and why she was telling everyone. He reflected on the man, who was incredibly strong, and was able to make it to the 39th floor. He looked at the novice's kit, and decided to get stronger by all means. He thought about how the man despised him, and how the main character laughs because of the items he received. He was determined to get revenge on them by all means. At that time, the protagonist had finished destroying 100 orcs and had reached his limit. The guy wanted to poison himself to the next floor, but assumed it would be much harder and decided to look at some artifacts. He looked at the items that were in his inventory and was finally ready to move out. He entered the 9th floor. The mission was to straighten out the horned wolves. He realized that wolves don't use guns like orcs and goblins. He intended to be as careful as possible. Suddenly, the guy's face changed, and he was able to stop the horned wolf at the last moment, which instantly attacked him. Although the base strength of the monsters was weaker than the orcs, the hero killed one of them, and a huge number of wolves pounced on the guy. The guy remembered his past, where he almost died from the wolves. But this time he dodged the attack of one of the enemies, and with an instant blow, he cut off the monster's head. The other enemies were already on their way, but the protagonist at the last moment jumped up, and he managed to avoid the attack and stand on the horns of the wolves. He stood and looked at his enemies like puppies. The guy admitted that he had no time for them and used the bracelet. Because of the huge weight, the wolves started screaming and were eventually crushed. The protagonist was determined to get to the 10th floor as soon as possible and tell everyone P9. The guy wanted to get secret quests and rewards on the 10th floor. There was only one way for the guy to be on the 10th floor safely, and that was to get past 9 as quickly as possible and get to the next floor. The hero used his bomb skill and caused a huge explosion. The protagonist destroyed 30 enemies, and also the system checked his qualifications and that the guy had 2 parts of 3 keys. A little later, night fell and a wolf Dalkin appeared, which became much stronger on the 7th night. The protagonist couldn't understand what it was. He felt something wrong and pulled out a stone that was emitting light. The guy didn't understand where the enemies had gone, but suddenly he noticed that something had skipped behind his back. The hunter instantly shined his light in that direction, but there was no one there. The boy was scared, as he was sure that something had definitely passed by. At that time, there was a horrible monster behind the protagonist's back, and he instantly reacted and tried to strike it once. However, the fact that he chopped the monster did not help at all. It was as if it had no physical shell. The enemy attacked the protagonist and went through the hunter's body, which scared him incredibly badly. The protagonist already thought that nothing was going on, and just as he got excited, he was notified that he had lost some of his power. These were ghosts that only acted on the artificially created night. Enemies would not attack until they had sucked out some of the hunter's abilities. The protagonist was terrified of this ability, and the normal attacks were not working at all. The protagonist also did not understand the meaning of the words that the seal was weakened. He could not even imagine who these ghosts were trying to wake up. The protagonist received a hidden quest reward, which was a rank. The guy couldn't turn down such an opportunity, but for now, he kept running away. He had no idea at all how to win in such a situation. Through the body of the protagonist passed monsters and sucked his strength. From anger, he used his skill then caused a huge explosion. He turned around to see if this method worked, but unfortunately it did not work and the ghosts continued to attack. The guy was terrified that even magic skills didn't work on the enemies. He kept running away and the enemies kept sucking out his abilities. The protagonist fell to the ground, causing his pet to fall out. The ghosts immediately became interested in the toad. They surrounded the poor animal and were going to take his powers. The guy began to cry and worried about his friend, but suddenly there was a notice that the ghosts die and the powers return. In the place where there was a frog there was a light, and the enemies began to die. The guy was shocked by this ability of his beast, and he continued what he started and headed into battle. He spit out his acid, which was very effective at dealing with ghosts. Toad was an animal of chaos, and chaos had the ability to not mix with anything, and at the same time harmonize with everything. The guy realized that attacks with a special property worked on counters. The protagonist decided that in this case, he was also able to. He clutched a key in his hand and hit one of the ghosts. Thanks to a small part of the sacred power inside the key, he managed to strike. After that, a huge number of ghosts flew at the protagonist. The protagonist decided to use a joint attack. After a while, the protagonist was able to cope, and finally the day came. The guy had no life on his face at all. The guy was sure that he definitely needed a weapon that could use sacred power. Even though he could do it with his bare hands too, but because of this kind of battle, he had a lot of blind spots. The guy pondered if there was something that could modify the key into something useful. Suddenly an enemy appeared, ready to pounce on the guy. The wolf rushed to attack, but the guy hugged him, which surprised the beast incredibly much. The hero admitted that he missed the horned wolf incredibly much. The guy was glad there were monsters to catch, and hugging the wolf too broke its backbone. The guy killed one of the enemies, and the others became wary, at which time the protagonist with a manic grin told the rest of the beasts to go to him. After a huge amount of time, the hero killed 30 more enemies. Night came. After every 30 kills, night came. Now the guy was more prepared. He had night vision and a self-made holy rod. Actually, the process of creating the weapon was very simple. Putting a piece of the key in a bag, he filled it with sand and scoured it to the stick. Now the protagonist was determined to destroy all the ghosts. The guy at an incredible speed coped with enemies, and in the end the fight for him was too easy, and he killed 100 enemies. Finally, the guy was done with the ghosts, and he started screaming with happiness. The protagonist was happy that he could finally rest at night. Also, the guy thanked his frog and stroked its head. The guy thought about the fact that the guys would be in danger if they went up to this floor. The protagonist opened the community and saw a huge number of comments from the guys who were on the 8th floor. The guy shared information about ghosts and how to fight them. He was satisfied with the work done and paid attention to the fact that the peak requested a friend request.